At this time, I'd like to turn it over to my friend, Alan Zaremba. Alan, how are you?
I'm good, Ryan, and thanks for that nice introduction.
You sound great. Excited to be here.
I feel great. As Ryan mentioned, this webinar is about the foundational course in organizational communication. I've been teaching at Northeastern on the faculty since 1981. And in 1982, I developed the course Organizational Communication. Before I came to Northeastern, I was teaching at the State University of New York at Fredonia. And there in 1977, I started the course in organizational communication, and it's evolved. And I've become, I've got an affection for the course over the years. I don't know if it seems wise to have an affection for a course, and perhaps that suggests that there's some missing parts in my social life that I have an affection for a course, but I think you know what I mean. I like the course. I think it's an important course, but it has challenges. And this webinar is about the challenges and how you can deal with those challenges if you're teaching or directing the foundational course. So let's get started and talk about some of the challenges that I see. And I think you can put the challenges into three categories. The first category is the nature of the student population, the people who take this course. The second challenge deals with the course content. And the third challenge deals with instruction and instructors, and particularly in this COVID environment. I hope we're done with COVID and teaching virtually, but for right now, we have some challenges that are related to instruction, even if there wasn't COVID, but certainly given COVID. So in terms of the students, this is typically the first exposure students have to organizational communication studies. Many students arrive with different notions about what the course is, despite what you might write in the paragraph that describes the course. Students come into the class thinking it's about how to organize speeches. Some students think this is a course that centers on skill sets and how they can improve their communication skill sets. Well, that's a part of the course. This idea that it's about one narrow approach or narrow aspect of organizational communication is incorrect, and you have to disabuse students of that initially. You get students that come from different academic backgrounds. You might have students who are majoring in communication studies, students who are in human resources or business, some in psychology. So you've got students with the various levels of preparation who take the course. It's not unusual in 2021 for students to represent different ethnicities and different nationalities. However, as it relates to this course, people from different countries view the organization and people in the organization differently. So a challenge here is to recognize the diverse approaches people have to leadership, for example, to subordinate to superior communication, for example. Another student-related challenge is this could be a required course for some students, and for other students, they're taking it as an elective or they're interested in it. So you have a population which could include prisoners, people who are taking this course very reluctantly because they have to, and others who are excited about it. So that diverse student population is an issue that you've got to address when you teach the class. In terms of course content, this is a foundational course for future study. Therefore, there is significant breadth in the course. You've got to present each area in the course and understand that each area has to be presented with meaningful depth. If you're going to be presenting a subject, and that subject is going to be the springboard or foundation for another class, you've got to present it with enough detail for it to be meaningful. All right. In terms of content, you've got issues that this course deals with many theories. You have to present several theories because they are foundational to understanding organizational communication. Many students and even many faculty members are not keen on studying or presenting theory. I had a fellow who was teaching this course as an adjunct. He told me he skipped the theory part, which is very problematic. You've got to present the theory in a way that people can digest it. And so that's a challenge, to present the various theories in a way that's understandable to faculty as well as to the students. All right. The course deals with new technology. So one issue that you have when you deal with new technology is that technologies evolve rapidly. Who knew about Zoom 24 months ago? Now everybody knows about Zoom. So the issue of teaching new technology is you've got to be up on the new technology. But that's a secondary concern compared to what I think is the larger concern, that some people think that technology provides a panacea for organizational communication issues. They don't. Sometimes technology actually creates communication issues. So a challenge in terms of course content is to disabuse people of the notion that technology is a panacea. Okay. How about in terms of instruction? What are the challenges related to instruction? Well, if this is a multi-sectioned foundational course, you have to have a degree of uniformity. If the people are going to take advanced classes and get funneled into these advanced classes, then the foundational course has to be, to some extent, uniform. New faculty may be asked to teach this course, and these faculty may have expertise in other areas, but they are told at the last minute or they're asked at the last minute, maybe told at the last minute, to teach the course. This is a problem. I give you an example. I was an interim chair for a while, and when I became interim chair, it was at the last minute, and we had to hire somebody to teach my organizational communication classes. Well, these people just were not that familiar with organizational communication, so you had that issue of new faculty teaching a course that they might be expert in something else entirely. Lastly, in every area, we've got the issues of COVID and how you teach a class virtually. I've taught this course, as I said, since 1977, if you count my time at SUNY Fredonia, and I can assure you that the last semester when I taught it virtually provided different levels of a challenge in terms of instruction. Okay, so what do you do? How do you deal with these various issues? I've had some success. I'm eager to hear if some of the people who are participating in the webinar, if you have other suggestions, but I'm going to make some suggestions about how you can address some of these challenges in this course that I'm so fond of. Okay, the first recommendation is that from the very beginning, you want to have students get their hands around what this is all about. What is this about? What does organizational communication mean? And you emphasize certain key principles. The first is that this course deals with all organizations, not just businesses. This is not business communication. This is a course about how all organizations communicate. Fraternities are an organization. Your church is an organization. You belong to a political party, that's an organization. The theater group that you might be involved with, or a museum, that's an organization. So the first thing is, this is something that's not just about businesses, but applies to all organizations. Second, you need to bang out that this is not a course that's primarily or wholly about communication skill sets. As I mentioned earlier, many students take the course thinking that, okay, I'll be better able to make a business presentation after it. You might be, but that's not the focus of the course. That's not the alone focus of the course. So you introduce the fact that this course is going to deal with how to cultivate communication networks between different units in an organization. You might want to talk about how, you might mention that the course is going to deal with how communication creates organizational culture and how organizational culture affects communication and how that culture and that communication affects the efficiency of organizations. And you also want to mention that this is going to talk about new and to juxtapose new and conventional methods for communicating and see which are the best approaches. In the very beginning of the course, you want to bang out that all members of organizations have communication responsibilities. This is not a course for people, this is not a course only for people who want to go into corporate communication. No matter what you do in an organization, you have communication responsibilities. And the last thing in this first slide that I'm mentioning that you want to mention at the beginning to deal with a diverse student population is that just because you're bright, that doesn't mean you're going to be an effective communicator. That intelligence does not guarantee efficiency as a communicator. Okay. Now we get to defining what organizational communication is. I think, again, to deal with this diverse notions of what it is, you want to define organizational communication simply as an area of study. And that area of study examines why organizations must communicate efficiently, how organizations can communicate effectively, and what are the effects of communication on the organization. So I think simply defining what organizational communication is, again, can deal with this diverse notion that students come to a class with. And lastly, on this slide, we have to explain that communication has to be looked at from both a transmission and a constitutive lens. All right, I met a guy at a conference who was the editor of the Journal of Employee Communication Management. And he said to me, as far as he's concerned, communication means getting what's in his head to what is in somebody else's head. And he's not wrong that communication involves getting what's in your head to someone else, to someone else's head. But that's not it only. You have to look at communication from a constitutive perspective as well. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a boss who is a bully. The boss is always being negative and disparaging you. Well, if you only look at communication from a transmission perspective, you could say that person's a good communicator. He's getting what's in his head or her head to your head. But from a constitutive perspective, the way this person is communicating is going to warp the organization. So you've got to look at communication both from a transmission and a constitutive perspective. In order to deal with student levels of enthusiasm, you want to present case studies. You want to employ exercises and get students involved. You want to require students to demonstrate an ability to apply principles to cases. So right off the bat in the class, you want to define communication, dispel notions, and get people involved. Okay. How do you deal with content-related problems? The problems of breadth and depth? Well, you've got to ensure that the course is multifaceted. I provided a list here of all the things that I think are absolutely essential in a course in organizational communication. Save on the next slide, I mentioned various theories, but you've got to talk about how to manage information. You've got to talk about these various other issues. Crisis communication is a very hot topic now. You can't teach this course and not talk about the effects of ethics and organizational communication. And if you think organizational communication is important, how do you test to see whether or not you're communicating effectively? You need to present, as I said, theories are central to the course. You want to invite students to identify applications and show that there are applications. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. The examples of how you could show applications with systems and classical theory. You take systems theory. A basic principle is that an organization is made up of interdependent parts, and these parts need to communicate. That if you don't have parts that are communicating interdepartmentally and are communicating independently, you have a silo effect which can corrode the organization. All right. So you give us an example. Most of our students were in their infancy, if they were alive at all, at 9/11. But they know about 9/11, and we know that various agencies of the government had information that they didn't share with other agencies, and that's why we were unprepared for the 9/11 attacks. Much more recently, on January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed, also there were agencies, units of the government that had information that they didn't share with others. So These are practical examples of how not applying systems theory can create very horrendous breakdowns. A classical theory, there are a number of principles of classical theory, but just take scientific management, which is the notion that you can study a task, identify the best practice of that task, and then communicate to employees how to do the task the best way. All right. Take a look at sports analytics. Right now, this is so hot. You can't watch a baseball game without seeing an outfielder look at his batting cap to see what position he ought to be in for a particular batter. What's happening is people are analyzing the game, deciding what the best possible way to defend a particular batter is, and tell the players where to stand. The point here is that you can find a practical example to make scientific management come alive. Man, scientific management has its flaws. There are more than one best way, Taylor's position notwithstanding. But to understand the basic principle of classical theory, you can use this example. All right. How about new technology? I think the best way to deal with this is to juxtapose new technologies with conventional technologies and say, okay, are these technologies more efficient? What do they do well? And what are some of the problems with it? We talk a lot about media richness in organizational communication. Are the new technologies richer than conventional technologies? In what way are they advantageous in creating a healthy environment in the organization? Ask students how they typically send and receive information. So you'll see what is novel, what is new, what is the newest technology that people are using. And emphasize that new technologies are not panaceas, and invite students to identify problems that they have run into because of the reliance heavily on new technology. This is not to say new technology is an abomination at all. It's just that it's not to emphasize that it's not a panacea. Okay. Instructional related challenges. Okay. I think you have to have clear guidelines for these courses, and you've got to give the instructor a bit of autonomy. So here, I think the text that you select has to be accessible to new faculty, meaning they can understand it. If you've got a new faculty member and that faculty member doesn't have this as an area of expertise, they've got to be able to understand the content as much as the students have to understand the content. And you've got to present it in a way that's digestible to students. And I think the auxiliaries are very important. You want the auxiliaries to help an instructor in terms of facilitating the instruction, result in a degree of course consistency, and allow for an instructor to bring a little of who she or he is into the class. So you want the course to have some consistency, but you can make it clear guidelines for these classes, but you also have to give people an opportunity to add their own flavor. If you have an opportunity to provide mentors for new instructors, I think that's a good approach as well. I know the example I gave previously about how I was the chair for a short period of time as an interim, and I became the mentor to the people who replaced me. And I think the faculty appreciated my efforts. All right. Now, in the COVID world, even in not COVID world, you want this course to be interactive. Interactivity is very important, but in a COVID world, it has to be interactive. So you want to pre-assign cases. You want to pre-assign exercises. I've written here, invite students, and I should have put invite in quotation marks, because what I do is I cold call. It doesn't make me the very most popular fellow on the block, particularly initially. But what I do is I get people involved to the extent where I say, okay, prepare the case ahead of time. Then when you come into class, I'm going to ask you your opinion about the case, and students are primed to discuss. And I'll tell you that I've had a degree of success with students in the beginning not being too happy about cold calling, and at the end feeling that it really facilitated their understanding of the subject matter because they were compelled to be ready for questions. All right. The people at Kendall Hunt were very clear that this should not be an advertisement for my book. And I hope it's not. I hope my enthusiasm for the course is coming through on this webinar. It is difficult to be dispassionate about a book that you wrote yourself. I think this book does dot the I's, cross the T's in terms of providing a text that can be valuable in terms of teaching this class. All right, what do I think are key features? First, I think it's accessible. Students have said that they can understand the concepts in the book. They can understand how theories apply because of the book, that it's not a turgidly written, again, it's tough to be dispassionate, and there are other good books out there. I'm not saying that mine is the only book out there, but it's a book that's accessible. It is comprehensive. All of the issues that I think are germane to organizational communication are in the book. Yeah, sure. I'm sure there are people who might think that something else might be important, but this is a book that is comprehensive. On a further slide, I'll talk about the various parts of it in the book, but it is comprehensive. And then there are many features. The book starts with a case. I think it's important. I'm sorry, each chapter starts with a case. Right? Each chapter ends with a group case, so that students, after discussing the chapter, have to meet in groups to solve yet a second case that deals with some of the topics that were discussed in the chapter. And in those instances, they not only have to apply what they learned, but they have to demonstrate they can communicate in a group in order to effectively solve the case. Each chapter has an ethical question that's related to the content of that chapter. Each chapter has an apply the principles exercise. I guess the point here is that as a teacher, you can use these cases to avoid straight lecturing. I mean, I think in an interactive course, and I believe this has to be an interactive one, if you have features like this that require students to interact, it takes the burden off the instructor in terms of lecturing and makes the course more interesting, meeting the challenge, the content and student-related challenges I mentioned earlier, and also the instructor-related challenges. I also have a feature that's in many of the chapters called Practitioner Perspective, where I ask people who are practitioners about the role of communication in their work. Craig Ingram is a lawyer. Dwayne Vild is a prison warden. Elizabeth Barker is the head of the museum in Pittsburgh. These people opine, it's an interview format. I ask the question, they respond to various questions about how communication affects their work. And the book has a turnkey instructor's manual. I believe that if all you wanted to do is follow the manual, you wouldn't have to do much in terms of preparation, which I don't think that's fair. I think that there are people who want to inject their own approach, but I think in terms of creating a consistency, this is a good approach. And it's also good for people who are given this job to teach this course at the last minute. All right, I said it's comprehensive. These theories of classical human resources and human relations, systems, cultural, critical theory are all discussed in the book, and there are applications. There's a chapter on selecting the best method for communicating, how to manage information, what kinds of messages have to be sent, what's the best way for sending them, establishing external and internal, upward and horizontal and downward networks. We talk about the informal and the formal networks. We talk about the relationship of communication and organizational communication and culture. And then there are chapters on each of these areas that are on this slide, including crisis communication, teams, how to interact in teams in organizations. And I think they're all relevant, otherwise I would not have put them in the book, but it's a particularly relevant chapter on how to test communication quality. And I was involved in the early days with the old ICA audit, and I talk about various auditing techniques that can be employed. The manual, as I said, is a turnkey approach. It provides step-by-step guidelines. There are cases and guide questions throughout, and there are exam questions that appear in it as well. So, in summary, I'm enthusiastic about this course, and I hope it shows in the nature in this webinar. There are challenges that exist. Those challenges, you've got a diverse student population. You have content issues that are related to this course. Some of these content issues are related to any foundational course, but I think you have some that are specifically related to this one because of the many theories that are involved and the breadth of subject. And you have instructional challenges, particularly in a COVID era. How do you deal with these? How have I had some success? Right off the bat, you want to define the course clearly for a diverse audience so they can get their arms around the course. You make sure the course is comprehensive. You explain theories with case applications and not necessarily the case that begins the chapter, the case that ends the chapter, but real world applications. You use interactive tools in terms of teaching. That is, you encourage students to participate. Use a text that's easy, not necessarily easy to read, but accessible. And you follow a standard format that concurrently allows for individual inclusions. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this formal part of the presentation. As I said, I have an affection for this course. I think it's a very important course because so many areas of our world deal with communication in organizations. Again, not just businesses, fraternities, our church organizations, the clubs we belong to, even some people will extend it to our extended families could be seen as an organization. So understanding organizational communication is important. And I think you can meet the challenges in this course by using some of the suggestions and applying them to your own classes at your own institutions. Thank you very much. And Ryan, I'm glad to take questions that people have.
Thank you so much, Alan. I appreciate it. That was very interesting, and I'm glad you're excited about it. I can feel it. So thank you. You mentioned the classroom discussion, how you cold call on your students. That makes you super popular. How does that participation factor into the final course grade for your students?
Well, what I do is I explain right off the bat that participation is important. And I require students to come in with an outline for each of the cases. And in the beginning of the class, I will ask students to respond to the cases. Tell me what the case is about and tell me how you've answered the questions that appear at the end of the case. If a student cannot do this if a student cannot do it once, it's not a terrible crime. But if on a regular basis, students are not prepared, that's going to affect their class participation grade. So they get a check if they can, and they don't get a check if they can't. And after a while, I don't even have to make a check because I know which students, and most of them really do respond well to this, are participating and who are not.
That's great. Do you have any examples or ideas on how to assess organizational communication quality?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, sure, Ryan, and as I've mentioned, I think this is an important part of the class. Yeah, there are a number of approaches. If you can use focus groups. The old ICA audit, which is in the public domain now, included a survey, a follow-up interview procedure, what they called a critical incident procedure. And these, as well as focus groups, can glean information that's relevant. I think if you've got to make sure that if you use a survey, you're asking the right questions. You don't want to just ask questions that are related to skill sets, because you might find out that people are excellent public speakers, but they don't communicate interdepartmentally. So the key to the success of these tools is asking the right questions. But a survey, a follow-up interview, what we call critical incidents, where you ask people for an example of great communication and poor communication, these are important. And these can be applied.
This is from a Facebook viewer. How have your students enjoyed this method of teaching the course?
I've had success, I'm sure not, if you polled everybody, I wouldn't get 100% success, but students seem to respond well to it. As I mentioned, initially, there might be some reluctance regarding the cold calling, but my evaluations have been excellent. I get contacted by students subsequently who say things like, hey, wherever I work, I apply this. A topic that seems to be very popular is I talk about permeability in subsystems or subunits in an organization. And students say, boy, my boss really loved that when I talked about permeability. I mean, that's just one example. It does repeat. So I think the students have responded very well to it. I've had success with student evaluations and people telling me, hey, I didn't know what this was about. I didn't think I could stay awake. I had to take this class, and now I'm enjoying it. I'm thinking of taking another one.
That's great. That's great. That's the ultimate transformation there. What do you think about using a semester-long organizational simulation to dramatize the course principles?
I think that that's not a bad idea, but I would recommend it as a second course. That in the advanced course to this, we have it's not entirely a simulation, but a large part of the course deals with examining an organization in terms of their organizational communication health. Do I think that an entire semester of simulation could work? I do. I can't say that I've had an experience with an entire semester with it. I think it would be key that everybody who is taking this course have a little bit of an introduction to the principles of organizational communication, even if it's just 1 or 2 weeks, so that you make sure everybody's on the same page before you do the simulation. So I've had some experience with an advanced class with a large portion doing what is, simulating, I guess, an audit, a communication audit. But I have, even in that class, had a couple of weeks of foundational information, which I think is really important. I haven't had an entire class that has been a simulation.
Thank you. Have you included, for example, America as an organization, let's see, as an organization or other dynamic organizations such as policymaking organizations without being perceived as partisan?
It's a tough job. And the way you do it is by presenting examples of good and bad from both political parties. I'll give you an example. When we talk about ethics, if you want to talk about the politicians withholding information from the public, you make real sure that you want to talk about a Republican withholding information, you immediately talk about a Democrat withholding information. For example, if you remember the controversy with weapons of mass destruction and President Bush being challenged about that and whether or not he was being candid, when I present that, I immediately follow with President Johnson and the Tonkin Gulf resolution and how he was challenged. So I think it's essential because politics is very charged and you don't want to reflect your political inclination in the class. So I think you've got to be very careful to find issues on both sides. And it's not too tough to do. Then it's unfortunate that if you're going to find an issue on one side, you can find it on the other side as well. And you just have to make sure your political bias is not evident.
Great. Another one from a viewer. This viewer teaches an undergrad level course and their students have a hard time grasping all the concepts and how organizations work. Therefore, they haven't taught audits at that level. What level is your undergraduate course?
Usually it's a foundational course, but students usually don't take it until either their the second semester of their freshman year or first semester of their sophomore year. So I think that when you explain audits, which are just tests, you've got to really make it real basic. And that is, you talk about validity, you talk about reliability, you say that all you're doing is trying to assess whether or not the organization is doing a good job. You don't go into much detail about statistical analysis. You just don't, because it's an early level course. But I think the principle that you can create a test without necessarily doing the analyses of the test in that course is an important one. And explaining different types of tests, like a focus group, at least conceptually, students they probably have experienced being in a focus group. So I don't do in that first class a tremendous amount of analysis of audits. I do explain what an audit has to include, that is, it has to be valid and it has to be reliable, and that there are different options to doing it. But I understand the position that you don't want to go into tremendous detail about the analysis part because it might be over the head of a first level student. I do think even a student who's a second semester freshman can get the idea that it's important to assess whether or not the job is being done.
Finally, how do you utilize the end of chapter cases, the group exercises?
Well, here's what I recommend. This is the 4th edition of the book, and this is I used to have a case in the beginning and a case at the end, but this is the first time I've actually included the group cases. Here's how I think they should work. After you've gotten done with a chapter, say the chapter is about communication networks, you present this case and you break up the class into X, depends on how large the class is, X number of groups. And you give them the case to solve in the groups. Now, the group has to demonstrate, the group has to analyze the case using the principles from the course, from the chapter. But very significantly, they have to demonstrate that they can communicate efficiently in order to solve the case. So some of the very issues that you might have discussed in the chapter are going to be reflected in how they communicate to solve the communication problem. So the way I use it, or I recommend that it's being used, is you end the chapter, and this is, I think, very good for instructors because it increases the interactive level of the course, and it doesn't require that an instructor continue to lecture. Students are broken up into groups. They've got to solve the problem. They've got to subsequently present their solution, but they've got to experience what it's like to communicate in groups in order to solve the problem. So that's what I suggest. And I tough again to be dispassionate about your own idea, but I think this is a good tool in so many ways.
Thank you so much, Alan. And to all the viewers out there, Alan has been gracious, and I'll be sending his email address. So if you have questions about the course or publication, you can contact him direct. As a final note, I invite you to join us for the Equity and Inclusion Leadership Series presented by Drs. Aaron Thompson and Houston Barber. This series is dedicated to creating a personalized equity approach for educators and leaders in both the public and private sectors. To learn more, visit he.kendallhunt.com. Once again, thank you, Alan, for your time today. This was great.
My pleasure.
In the coming days, each of you will receive a copy of this recording and contact information for Alan, and we can answer your questions offline as well. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you.